Thanks for staying with us right here on Sunrise as we continue this morning now in the wake of the debate around land expropriation without compensation, which ultimately is a human rights issue that should, of course, we should take into consideration the rights of those seeking land and those who stand to lose it. Now, the big question from some quarters has been, whose land is it? And which land, are we talking about? How was the land taken and from whom and why? Now, that brings us to the book of the moment by Advocate Tembeka Ngcukatoibi, and he's joining us this morning to take us down a history lesson to enlighten us on the role played by South Africa's first black lawyers and how that birthed constitutionalism as well. So he's joining me this morning. And just off air, good morning to you, Sam. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So before the break, me and you were talking about how everybody talks to you about everything else but the book. So we're here to talk about the book. Why is this book important to you first?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's important because it sort of fills I would say, a professional and a personal void. Because I have worked in the area of human rights basically since I began to practice law. But I have always been intrigued by the sheer absence of black voices in human rights discourses and in human rights practices. And the book tries to explain from a historical point of view that in fact, ever since the emergence of this polity called South Africa, there were human rights practicing law. So in a sense, it explains my own passion, my own role, and my own historical understanding of where we stand as black lawyers.
Okay, so you paid tribute to a lot of lawyers, obviously, in the book and through their work. How important were those figures to you as a practicing advocate currently? Like, how far back do you go with their stories?
They were very significant for me, largely because I didn't know about them, certainly before I began the research into the book. And I think the discovery of their very existence was an enlightening moment. And the discovery of the cases that they took on was actually a transformative moment. Because the most important message is that actually the very origins of constitutional speak, the very origins of the doctrines of equality, the doctrines of freedom, and the doctrines of dignity are traceable directly to the ideas of the very first black lawyers in South Africa.
So these are the Henry Silver Williams, Alfred Mangena, Richard Msimang Pislika Isakaseme, Ngubi Paswayo, and George Munsiwa, some of them. These are some, obviously Pixley is that guy that we all got to know. He's linked to the ANC and all of that. So funny enough, when I thought of this moment, it reminded me of, there's a movie on the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, who was like in the US. He was a lawyer, only taking cases just to protect black people who were violated against because of racial.
No, there are parallels to the work of Thurgood Marshall, and in fact to the work of the entire civil rights movement in America. There are also parallels as well in the sense that the work of people like Thurgood Marshall for a long time in American discourses had been punched out of history. And it is only most recently that that work has been restored into its correct place. In South Africa, the work that I have tried to do have simply never been undertaken before. In fact, human rights as a discourse has always been projected as something that emerges in the late 80s and the early, perhaps late 70s and the early 80s. But what we had never actually understood is that human rights is to be anchored in the very stories of struggle, because human rights was, in a sense, a response to land dispossession. It was a response to colonial aggression. It was a response to racism.
So it's even pre-formation of the ANC, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, because that's what you touch on in the book.
Yes, this is a very interesting part that I come across. The very first notion of an unbiased judiciary is an idea that comes in the 1870s, and not from a lawyer, but from a journalist, John Tengo Jabavu. And the context in which he was writing was about how to ensure that the jury system, which was responsible for trying many criminal trials, is fair and objective, because what he discovered was that since the jury system tended to be populated by white people, it was predominantly biased against a black accused and biased in favor of white complainants and white accused. So a crime, for instance, where the accused is white and the complainant is black, there will be a tendency to acquit the white person. But a crime where the accused is black and the complainant is white, a tendency to convict. This is what he tried to investigate, and he ultimately came to the conclusion that it would be better for everyone if there is a non-biased judiciary which is populated, of course he used the word men, by men trained in the law.
Okay, so you in the book, obviously, you went through these men's stories, some of the cases that they have to deal with, like people just being removed from the land that they occupied, their kettles being destroyed, you know, sometimes in like 8 days.
Yes.
The research that went into finding these cases.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so you always start with secondary sources. So you start with books that are published, and you start with articles that are published, and that's your secondary sources. And the secondary sources sometimes will contain footnotes. In fact, my own book contains a lot of footnotes, more than 700 footnotes. But so they will take you the footnotes that will tell you where you can look. So I then went to, not to the secondary text, but to the primary text to try and find out where the footnotes are. So a lot of the material in the primary text is in archives. And these archives roughly are divided into three. So they are the historical archives that you get in places like Cape Town, Johannesburg, Pretoria. And then there are newspaper archives, the reports that came at the time as the events were unfolding. And most of these, there were black newspapers that we actually know very little about. And those black newspapers, I mean, you start off, my book starts off with Imvo Zabansundu, which was edited by, which was a Xhosa newspaper, edited by John Tengo Jabavu. But it goes on to other newspapers. Seme also had his own newspaper called Abantu Batu. And Alfred Mangena started a newspaper called The Native Advocate. And those newspapers still provide probably the best source of news in relation to the lives of black people that lived in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But you raise an important story about the dispossession, how the dispossession unfolded. So the primary text that a lot of people have used in relation to explaining the effects of the 1913 Land Act has been Saul Platch's book, Native Life in South Africa. But I discovered through the work of Richard Msimang that there are actually works that he himself wrote at the time the 1913 Land Act came into effect. And so the stories of these dispossessions where people were given 24 hours notice, 8 days notice, 7 days notice, or sometimes no notice at all.
Yes.
And those came directly from the works of Msimang. Some of them came from the works of Pixley Isaac Sem, especially the work that he did in Swaziland, where ultimately when he took a case to the Privy Council, the decision was taken that actually black people have got no notion of ownership of land. The land is sort of owned in a communal sense, and therefore it could not assert ownership over white ownership, and white ownership took precedence over black ownership.
So the book, obviously the timing is just is perfect. Me and you were talking about being on time earlier on. You're right on time and you're never too early. Like the book just comes in when this conversation of land in our countries where there's different generations are saying different things.
Yes.
Who is this book aimed at? Because it goes so far back, but it's talking about such a current crisis that we're facing.
Well, I mean, what I think the book can help us with in relation to the current discourses on land is to lay a historical text and a historical foundation. Because, interestingly, the book starts with an ambitious topic, how the land was lost. And I think that from that moment, we can have a more intelligent conversation about how the land can be restored if we understand how it was lost. And I paint a picture that illustrates that the land was lost through a combination of war, through a combination of fraud, through a combination of deception. And I think once we understand that, then we can have a proper discussion on
and
how
it informs where the anger, the bitterness, the emotiveness, part of it is all those, what you've described.
No, precisely, and it also explains that what happened after the loss of land, the law was then used to protect it, solidify the loss of land, and which is why our starting point today is to use the law to redress.
Okay, so now, what should the legacy around land going forward, especially around the discussion that is currently happening in the National Assembly, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, what's clear is that the current dispensation of land is intolerable because it is still reflective of the racial biases of 1913. And what we need is a fair distribution of land. And what we've been debating is how to achieve a fair distribution of land. What's clear is that we have to be anchored by certain principles. One of the most important principles is constitutionalism. We have to be guided by a constitutional text.
Okay. In terms of, like, obviously what's currently happening, looking at the book, who are these men and why they're important? And then when we look at, like, the current, lawyers of today, what role do you think they're going to play? And the Constitution, obviously, going forward with the issue of land.
Well, I think what they will do is to inspire a generation of human rights lawyers. When we black lawyers practice law, we now know that we actually are standing in the shoulders of giants. So I think they are important not only as historical figures, they are important also to inspire us in relation to our commitment to human rights.
Well, great stuff. I'm sure you know that you're an inspiration to a whole new generation of young people. Some in law, some not even. But thanks for the great work that you're doing and for this book and documenting this moment. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for
All right,
inviting.
there you have it. That was advocate and published author Tembeka Ngcukatoibi about his book, The Land is Ours, South Africa's First Black Lawyers and the Birth of Constitutionalism.